As Sandra's work dinners began piling up like overdue bills, Paul approached the situation with the analytical mindset of a systems analyst. Quietly and systematically, he started looking into things. What he uncovered turned out to be far worse than he had imagined, something that would soon cast a heavy shadow over the morning routine. Paul had never thought of himself as someone prone to suspicion, at least that's what he told himself. But it became harder to hold onto that belief when Sandra began guarding her phone as if it were a lifeline and regularly staying out late for so-called networking events. In the early stages, she used to send him little updates from her outings. Lately, she didn't even bother. She would simply come home smelling faintly of a fragrance he didn't recognize and, when questioned, would deflect with a weary, "It's late, can we not do this right now?" If there was one principle Paul lived by, it was this: trust the data. Emotions were unreliable, often misleading, but hard facts and digital footprints told a much clearer story. And since Sandra's recent habits reminded him of the bugs he routinely identified in software systems, he chose to tackle the problem the same way he approached his job. 3 nights earlier, while Sandra was out having drinks with her colleagues, Paul turned to his most trusted companion, his laptop. He spent his days stress-testing complex networks, hunting for vulnerabilities. In his eyes, a marriage wasn't much different from a computer system. The key was knowing exactly where to look for the weaknesses. It took him under 10 minutes to install a discrete monitoring tool. He rationalized it using a time-tested excuse: he needed clarity. The application remained invisible on Sandra's phone, quietly delivering logs of her messages, calls, and locations to his inbox. There was a flicker of guilt, but it quickly dissolved under the weight of professional experience. He had watched too many clients compromise their own systems through carelessness and shortcuts to let hesitation stop him. With one final click, the installation was complete. At that moment, he grasped 2 undeniable truths: he had crossed a moral boundary, and strangely, he felt at peace with it. By the following morning, the information he'd been waiting for landed in his inbox. It wasn't some explosive revelation, just a trail of flirtatious messages exchanged with someone named Benson. The name alone triggered an image: someone who probably wore perfectly fitted polos and referred to every drink as a cold one. Message after message revealed a growing intimacy, punctuated with enough winks to make a teenager blush. Then came the line that sealed it: "See you at 7 at my place. You know where the key is. Can't wait." Oddly, Paul didn't feel devastated. There was no rage or emotional breakdown. Instead, he felt a distant curiosity, like watching a poorly made film you can't stop viewing. Everything now made sense: the late returns, the secretive phone habits, the unfamiliar cologne. Most of all, though, he felt justified. His instincts had aligned with the data, and that validation was unexpectedly comforting. The following morning, Paul did something he hadn't attempted in years. He got up early and made pancakes. A breakfast Sandra once adored before her world became consumed by work events and late-night outings. When she walked into the kitchen and saw the table set, she paused. Her usual air of distraction was replaced by visible surprise. Paul allowed himself a slight grin as he watched her try to read his mood. "Good morning," he said, gesturing toward the meal. "Thought we could try starting the day normally." Sandra blinked, momentarily off guard but trying to stay composed. "Oh, wow. Thank you, Paul," she replied, taking a seat. Her tone was pleasant, though forced. She drizzled syrup over her pancakes with a smile that seemed carefully constructed. Her phone remained out of sight but clearly within reach, resting just beside her. They ate quietly, with Paul breaking the silence now and then with small talk, asking about her schedule, her plans. Sandra answered cautiously, keeping her responses short and deliberately vague, unaware that the morning was building up to a confrontation. When her plate was nearly clear, Paul leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his coffee, and then casually asked, "So, how's Benson doing?" Her fork stopped mid-motion. Her expression shifted in a fascinating sequence: first surprise, then confusion, followed by a polite smile that stiffened the moment she realized he wasn't joking. "Who?" she replied, just a little too fast, her voice lifting an octave. "Benson," Paul repeated, his tone calm, almost conversational. "You know, the guy you spent last night with." "Don't try to play dumb, Sandra. I've read the messages." Her face contorted, blending shock with growing frustration. "You went through my phone?" she demanded, though her voice betrayed the weight of guilt behind the accusation. "Sure did," he answered evenly, slicing into his pancakes with exaggerated calm. When someone who audits security systems for a living sees a phone left within reach, it's practically an invitation. She shot him a furious look, trying to shift the blame. "Paul, maybe if you spent less time glued to your laptop and more time noticing me, we wouldn't be in this mess." He let out a short laugh, colder than he meant. I think I've been paying a lot more attention than you realize, Sandra. Far more than you ever thought I would. Well, I suppose I'm just the one footing the bills around here, huh? He said, pointing his fork at her with a crooked grin as her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. So here's what's going to happen. You have until tonight to get your things together. I'll be back at 8. If you're still here, I'll even help carry your stuff out. If not, then I guess we both walk away with what we wanted. Her mouth opened, then closed again, words failing her as she struggled to respond. Paul watched her flounder, and though a part of him tried to stay reasonable, he couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction in seeing her caught in the consequences of her actions. Without a word, she turned and marched upstairs, likely to scramble a last-minute plan with Benson, beg for sympathy, or maybe just have a private breakdown. Whatever it was, it didn't concern him anymore. He grabbed his car keys and left the house, already set on how the rest of his evening would unfold. Paul pulled into the driveway at exactly 8 o'clock, just like he said he would. A steady calm rested over him. Sandra's car was still parked outside, which didn't come as a surprise. He hadn't actually expected her to leave quietly without some kind of emotional scene. When he stepped through the front door, he found her on the couch, tension written all over her face. Her hair was slightly unkempt, and a few boxes sat around the room, some half-filled, some untouched. She wore that familiar expression, a careful mix of sorrow and defiance, the kind that had worked in her favor more than once. Paul, she began softly, her tone dipped in a calculated vulnerability. Can we just talk for a moment? He didn't move to sit down. Instead, he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her coolly. Her eyes dropped to the floor as though trying to collect her thoughts or find the perfect words. I know I made a mistake, but maybe if we could just... Let's not, he cut her off, pointing toward the nearest box with a flick of his hand. I'm here to make sure you're packed and out. Not to play counselor. She gave him a look that mixed disbelief and hurt, a look meant to elicit sympathy. But they both knew better. She had rehearsed this moment just like she did her speeches at corporate events, plenty of flair, but lacking authenticity. This isn't easy for me, Paul, she said, trying to summon some emotional weight. He lifted his shoulders in a shrug, the irony not lost on him. It's not supposed to be. Actions come with consequences. Her expression hardened, a spark of anger igniting in her eyes, but she kept her voice controlled. Maybe if you paid more attention to me than your computers, we wouldn't be here. He met her accusation with dry indifference. So that's it? I got distracted and you got bored? Maybe I should have updated myself like one of my systems added new features to keep you interested. She stared at him in disbelief. You're really ready to throw away years of marriage over a single mistake? She reached for a last bit of emotional leverage, her eyes glistening, hand pressed to her chest in that familiar display of sincerity he once found touching. One mistake. His voice remained even. Funny how that one mistake stretched across months, sneaking around, exchanging messages, and arranging secret meetings with Benson. Or are we playing with a different version of math now? She visibly tensed, her composure slipping. I'm done with this, she snapped, voice sharp. You can't just toss me out like this. I'm not tossing you out. Paul retrieved a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it out with a faint, smug expression. Thought you might want this as a keepsake. She snatched the paper from his hand, unfolded it quickly, and scanned its contents. Her face turned pale as she read. The note read, Dear Benson, appreciate you spending so much time with my wife. She clearly prefers your company. Feel free to cover the expenses she accumulated living under my roof. Just thought you should know she won't be staying here anymore. Best of luck explaining this to your wife. Her hands trembled as she clutched the note. You actually sent this to him? Oh yes, I sent it, Paul confirmed with a slight nod. And since I had some extra time this afternoon, I sent a copy to his wife too. Lovely woman. She seemed just as intrigued by the information. Sandra's face drained of color, replaced quickly by a flush of fury. You had no right to do that. I had every right, he said firmly, still calm. You wanted Benson. Well, now he gets everything that comes with that decision. And you get to explain yourself to all the people you deceived. Her hands balled into fists as she glared at him, this time with the realization that the control she once had was completely gone. I never thought you'd stoop to something so petty, she said bitterly. Paul let out a dry laugh. Petty? No. I'm just thorough, Sandra. That's what I'm known for. He motioned toward the boxes again. Now pack up. I've already done more for you than I should have. She opened her mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to yell or cry, but nothing came out. For once, she had no words, and to Paul, that silence felt like a long overdue end. After she finally left, Paul sat quietly in the empty house. A part of him half expected her to return, pounding on the door with some last desperate plea or apology. But the silence lingered uninterrupted. Eventually, he heard her car start. The vehicle pulled away, its taillights fading into the darkness. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, he exhaled a slow, measured breath. Over the past several months, Paul had felt as though he were trapped in a twisted game, maneuvering through a puzzle with no clear image, constantly second-guessing his steps. But now that everything had finally come to an end, an unexpected feeling settled over him. It wasn't the comfort of relief or the sting of sorrow, just a quiet void, as though the constant hum that once consumed his thoughts had suddenly vanished. That hollowness lingered, yet it was paired with a peculiar sense of finality, like the subtle peace that comes from finally closing a door that had been left ajar for far too long. He had no clear plan for what came next, nor did he know how he'd begin to rebuild after everything. Maybe he'd start jogging or finally hit the road on that long-postponed trip. Whatever path he chose, one thing had become unmistakably clear: he was done looking back.